You know what? I just want to escape from all the political madness in Washington, D.C. and go all the way to Birmingham, Alabama to talk with someone from London to talk about one of London's very own James Bond. And, of course, on the line with me right now on Keeping It Real is Andre Millard. Andre, thanks for joining me today.
No worries, Alex.
I have to get out of Washington because I'm sure you know you're a professor of history down there, and I'm following it from a news talk station. It's getting crazy. So let's escape that and talk about one of my favorite characters of all time, James Bond. And you're a professor of history, yet you're a Bond enthusiast. Were you also into the movies as well as history?
Well, yeah. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, Sean Connery is Bond.
Absolutely.
And although I wouldn't look at a movie now if you paid me to. I mean, Bond is the movies. I think if you did a survey of James Bond fans, I suspect a very small minority would be the readers of the books, although there were a lot. I mean, they were best-selling books, but it's the films that made Bond the global icon he is, and not the books.
And we're going to get into Ian Fleming because you got into Ian Fleming, and I'm sure you discussed him as much as everything else in your new book, Equipping James Bond, Guns, Gadgets, and Technological Enthusiasm. Of course, Q. Who can forget Q? He's kind of one of the lost arts of that movie, of that series, wouldn't you say?
Well, Q, I think, is one of the most interesting characters. The actor that played Q had the longest role in any of the movies, Desmond Llewellyn. And I think if you look at Q's career, you can see how the films changed their attitude towards technology. At the very beginning, Q is a very important person who knows the gadgets, right? I mean, Q is the guy that introduces you to the gadgets. But by the late 70s, 80s, Q is a comic figure. I mean, they completely reduce his importance, and I think that's significant.
Well, he does become a more funny character, yet he still provided James Bond with all the technology, even with some humor as the series went along.
He does, but he often doesn't know how to work it. I mean, that's the difference. I mean, at the beginning, Q asserts himself and says, put that stupid Beretta down and have a real gun, right? Yep. But at the end, he doesn't know how to operate half this equipment, and Bond has to help him. With the remote control from the BMW. Was that Pierce Brosnan's Bond? So yeah, Q does change a lot, and Q goes from the guy that understands the technology to a sort of the butt of the humor. I mean, one point I make in the book is that the bad guy always has like a science person behind him, right? Some evil ex-Nazi in a white coat.
Right.
And Q offers that same position for Bond. Used to be people thought of Q as the Merlin, as the magic man. But over time, Q just becomes the butt of the joke. Desmond Llewellyn was really upset that they made him change his outfit and dress in absurd clothing like baggy shorts and Hawaiian shirts. And he said, that just went completely against the character. Remember, Q stands for quartermaster, and that's the person that, knows the gadgets. And I think at the end of the thing, he's just a befuddled old guy like you and me trying to deal with the latest electronic toys.
Right. The iPhone 10 or whatever. But Andre Miller, as we were talking about James Bond, and one thing that intrigued me in your Zaccala article is you talk about the intelligence part of it, how Bond and Ian Fleming was so ahead of its time with the way intelligence was written and portrayed on the screen. That just fascinated me as well.
Well, Ian Fleming always wanted to make Bond the more authentic spy. That's why he introduced a lot of brand names into his books. Now, of course, it's all merchandising. But Fleming, who went through World War II in intelligence, wanted to try and make the book seem as realistic as possible. But the problem was that by the time that Fleming started to write the books, that's to say, in the 50s, the Bond era of intelligence was over. I mean, I argue in the book that James Bond is a nostalgic figure for both a period and an occupation that was gone. I mean, intelligence doesn't involve James Bond anymore. It's all done by machines.
It really is. And you also mentioned how this coincided with the space race. Of course, this weekend is the 50th anniversary of us landing on the moon. So tell us how Bond and the moon landing are kind of similar or connected here?
Oh, no. They're inseparable. I mean, space was made for Bond, and Bond was made for space. If you think about it, beginning of the 60s, the 60s was this time of great enthusiasm about technology. That's why technological enthusiasm is part of the book title. People were really convinced that a better future would open up with new technology. And at the cutting edge of technology was space. Now, I'm as enthusiastic about Apollo as you can possibly get. I mean, I'm watching all the programs. I can basically, tell you from memory all the communications between Houston Control and Apollo 11. But you look back on it and say, well, why? I mean, what was the point of putting a man in space with all that risk when you could have done it with a probe? And the point is that, America needed a James Bond. And what they got was, John Glenn and Neil Armstrong. And they became, these very macho, powerful figures who were in command of the technology. But looking back on it, the whole thing seems to be pointless to me. But having said that, if you look at the Bond films, they basically reflect what millions of people are watching on television. And they make that transfer. Those pictures of the guys in the control center.
Sure.
That becomes a trope of the Bond films. And as I point out in the book, there's a huge difference between the good guys and the bad guys. I mean, the good guys are all in those NASA, short sleeve nylon shirts, with the plastic thing in the pocket, in these nice rooms. And some of the images in the Bond films are actually taken from, NASA's footage, where the Russians are in some dark, doomy. I mean, the two sides, the good and the bad, I think really reveal where the Bond thing is going. But Bond wouldn't have survived the 60s had he not gone into space.
And much like the astronauts who landed on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, Armstrong, and the rest over there, he also communicated with the control room. And I'm thinking back to the Dame Judi Dench movie, but all throughout he'd talk in his watch or he'd talk in an earpiece. Someone was always communicating with him wherever he was. And of course, as you point out, they always told him to stay away from the girl, but that never happened.
Never happened at all. And the same thing happened with the astronauts, by the way. I mean, there's a wonderful book out about the astronauts' wives, which is a really great part of the story, And as one of them says, you think going into space was difficult? Try staying at home. With all the goings on. But, Bond was essentially a figure of the 60s. And the space race comes right into that. And the miracle is that Bond survived into the 80s and 90s and now the 21st century, which is something which I think is difficult to explain because we're over it now. Remember, the space shuttle flew first in a Bond movie before it actually, flew out of Cape Kennedy. So the space was always, the leading edge of the Bond films. But like everything else, when space, 1969 we were on the moon. 1970 Nixon cancels the Apollo program. And so Bond has to fly off to other places and meet other enemies. And my point is that he's always timely. He's relevant because he kind of captures our anxieties, our enthusiasm about technology.
We're talking with Andre Millard, professor of history at the University of Alabama. Now, you are from East London, so obviously Bond is sort of, would you say he's one of your idols because you both have that London connection, or what?
No. Bond is an upper-class person, so he would never appeal to someone like me. I mean, he's the tool of the establishment. I mean, Bond doesn't have a subversive, rebellious bone in his body. So no, I mean, Harry Palmer of the Ipcress file was my hero, Michael Caine, fellow East Londoner, and somebody who was never going to die for king, queen, and country, like Bond was, and always was looking out for number one. Was very, very suspicious of the ruling class. Whatever way you look at Bond, I mean, he's a servant of the ruling class.
That is true. If I'm not mistaken, he bent the knee in front of the Queen. At least one or a few of those movies, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely. And so, when, and then the Queen agrees to appear in this, a parachute beginning, I think, for the London Olympics. So, he's a servant of the crown, and in a way, a really strange figure to get all this attention in the 60s because he's not a rebel. I mean, if you look at the way he dresses, I mean, there's one of those iconic things. Bond always has to be in an evening suit, I mean, he has to be white tie and tails, which is really, there are not too many 60s heroes who look or act like that. You think of like Jack Nicholson, in Five Easy Pieces or Easy Rider. That's a 60s sort of hero, not a James Bond.
And so talk about the Cultural Revolution at that time. Obviously, everybody's talking about, everything going on. How did Bond play a role in that revolution during the 60s?
Well, because it was unlimited sex, wasn't it? I mean, that was the thing. Not to put too fine a point on it. I mean, the idea that women are out there just throwing themselves at you and ready for the old one-night stand is, I think, a really accurate reflection of the 60s. We seem to think that everybody got a piece of the action in the 60s, with the feminist movement and stuff like that. But if you look really closely, not really the case, Bond was this, misogynist. Same kind of thing as the TV series Mad Men, which I think captures it true. So there's no equality there between the sexes. And the Bond girls, in some quarters, is seen as a sort of disparaging thing. They're just there to support, the very macho male. The thought of having a female Bond or a Bond of color, is something that really kind of shows you how much we've kind of bought into that 60s figure. I mean, I'm sure, I don't know if you know that, but JFK was a huge Bond fan.
Oh, I'm sure.
He showed Dr. No in the White House, and he said that From Russia with Love was one of his 10 best, favorite movies. Well, Bond and JFK have got a lot in common when it comes to, the sexual revolution. And there's a really, I don't know if you ever remember Jay Hoberman of The Village Voice.
Okay, what did he have to write about?
Oh, he just wrote this thing that JFK and Bond were just, two peas in a pod, and they both had this idea of sort of, aggressive male supremacy in the 60s, and funnily enough, at that one point in time, the Brits were losing so much ground to the U.S. I mean, the Brits, after 56, the Brits didn't really have any kind of, global presence. So in a way, kind of James Bond makes up for that. Because in the books and the movies, he's always the main guy. I mean, the Americans are there to help Bond.
So would you say...
In real life, it was the opposite.
Would you say Ian Fleming wrote this because he loved the crown? I mean, you say...
Yeah, well, he what he wrote about was the good old days when people like James Bond can get the job done. And remember, James Bond is always seen as a secret agent. He's not. He's just like a commando. He goes in and punches people in the face and blows stuff up. And Fleming, those were his people. And, these were World War II people, civilians who'd been, forced into these incredible... I mean, the fact is that British intelligence was very poorly run, so most of these people ended up dead. And it was kind of in their honor that Fleming created the Bond character when all the real Bonds were all being put out of work because there wasn't any need for any. Once you've got satellite photography, once you've perfected electronic surveillance, you don't really need a secret agent anymore, do you?
Well, has that been happening here in the United States as well? I'm sure it has in all these different intel communities.
Well, of course it has. Of course, the CIA was the leading intelligence community that automated and mechanized before everybody else. I mean, the computer is one of the, vital tools of intelligence, and the U.S. was way in the lead. The other thing, which I point out in the book, is, aerial photography. If you got a satellite that can photograph, the name of your golf ball from, 3 miles up, what do you need a James Bond for? And that's what was going on in the intelligence community, and that's what Fleming was writing about. It was about those guys that he knew and liked from World War II were suddenly obsolescent. The other thing was, the British Empire's going down the tubes really, really quickly. So, in the books and the films, Britain always comes out on top because they got James Bond. But in real life, the opposite was happening.
Well, and so, talking about all this technology now, to stay a little current here, there's a face app where people are looking older, and they're saying now that's an intelligence tool to get our facial recognition. So it's gotten crazy over the years.
Oh, it has. And the Chinese are so far in advance of us, and it's really scary. I mean, much as I love Ian Fleming, you really should be reading George Orwell now because everything he said is coming true. And AI could be the biggest threat to individual liberties and a democratic system than any terrorist group. I mean, this is a really scary technology, and it's pretty easy to get a surveillance of a whole nation. If the Chinese can do it, with millions of Chinese, it'd be pretty easy for someone to, do face recognition for everybody in this country.
And a few cities have actually banned that facial recognition alone, which is a good thing. I think it's a good thing anyway. I want our privacy to be as private as possible, and it's also why we're in the intel community discussion here. I'm still a little ticked that the FISA warrants were happening on all these people, because they did feel like they were invading on U.S. citizens' rights. I mean, you might have a different take on that, but I just felt that intelligence was a little overreaching.
Explain that to me one more time, Eric.
The FISA warrants that were on the Trump campaign, just click back to that because of the intel stuff.
Okay, yeah.
That felt a little overreaching into citizens' lives here.
Yeah. I mean, the fact of the matter is I think we've got to accept the fact that, we don't have any privacy and emails are about as secure as writing on toilet doors. But when it gets to the point where, every move we make is tracked, and we have these, the Chinese have this system of kind of social marks. If they catch you crossing the street, not by crossing or throwing away some litter, then you can't leave the country. And that, I mean, sooner or later you're going to have to draw the line.
Right.
But all that intelligence is so not James Bond, though, is it?
No, it's not. But you know what I was thinking as we were talking about this is James Bond also knew how to turn the equipment, the technology off, like especially if it was with a woman. But he would take the technology and throw it away or turn it off. And
well, that's the point. That's the point. That's why we love him. I mean, we don't love him because he has these cool gadgets. We love him because he always triumphs against the machine. At the end of every James Bond movie, he destroys the villain's lair. There's this massive explosion. And every time James Bond does that, we think to ourselves, well, there's still a role for human agency. Yeah, machines might be running the show, but James Bond will always figure out a way, to get one better than the machine. And he does it with he does it with a screwdriver or something like that. So it's kind of like, well, if James Bond can do it, we can all do it. But I think you're right there in that he is a machine breaker, and that's the appeal of it.
Now, one scene that will always stick out to me because it's so artistic, because it's just so dramatic, is when Goldfinger tries to sear him in half. He has him laying down there, and that piece of technology was just so interesting to watch, and the way he got it to stop was even better.
Well, the Bond producers, Eon Productions, always claim that it was science, not science fiction. And the crazy thing about it, most people got their information about lasers from the Bond films, because the lasers in the Bond films were just years ahead of real life lasers. By the time they shot that famous scene, a laser had really a hard job cutting through a razor blade. So the people in the research labs measured the strength of the laser in Gillette. Do you remember the Gillette razor?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So, I mean, the effect in the film was somebody was underneath that table with a oxyacetylene torch. That's why you see Sean Connery sweating.
Because someone's under the table.
It was getting hot. It was getting really, really hot, and
here I was thinking it was because his privates might be seared off. No, it was because someone's under the table making sure that the laser works.
With a damn oxyacetylene torch, I mean, that stuff generates some heat. So, but in all the Bond movies, you see the laser. You got laser weapons later on. You've got lasers coming out of wristwatches and this and that and that. So a lot of these technologies, including, like GPS technologies, you remember in Goldfinger?
Remind me about that.
In the DB5, he puts the little locator device in Goldfinger's Rolls Royce, and he's following it in his DB5, that beautiful Aston Martin.
Oh, yes.
And he's got a little thing, a display in the...
Oh, like that radar tracker, right, type of thing?
Yeah, just the same as the GPS in a car that you can buy today. And a car today, comes with a little TV screen.
Well, by the way,
of it, right?
Yeah. By the way, just to be, today's 50 years since the Chappaquiddick car drowning of Mary Jo Kopechne and the whole Kennedy thing. If a GPS was on that, I think history would have been changed just a little bit.
Well, do you remember that Volkswagen advert that they had to withdraw?
No, well, I don't.
Oh, no, there was. You remember Volkswagen had the best advertisements. I mean, their advertisements were just streets ahead of GM. And they had a thing about a Volkswagen, I don't know if this is true, it was so well made that it would float.
Okay.
So they did have advertisements with little beetles floating. And allegedly they put out an advertisement saying if Ted Kennedy has been driving a Beetle, he'd be president. And they had to withdraw that. So that was but, a lot of stuff that we first see in James Bond films, including the smartphone, just 10, 20 years before they actually turn out. So as other people have said, the films in a way, are kind of, library of the future. I mean, you see the films, and you see stuff that you think, well, maybe one day, we'll have one of those. And so it works a lot just to introduce new stuff, which kind of puts the production crews, they've got to keep looking for new stuff to stick in those films.
Right, because they're still making the Bond movies. Now it's not going to be Daniel Craig. I believe they're moving on. So what is the future?
Oh, you kidding me? I thought... You think they've fired Daniel Craig?
Well, I know that they were looking elsewhere to be more diverse, I thought, but maybe it's still Daniel Craig. But
as far as I know, they are filming right now in Scotland, is what I understand.
Well, this will get you on the set.
Daniel Craig has signed up for it, yeah. I mean, this has been a pretty difficult Bond film to do. I mean, it's been delayed. It's supposed to be coming out right now, and it hasn't, and there have been problems with it. So this is difficult. But sooner or later, we're going to have a female Bond or a Bond of color. I mean, I think that's going to happen.
And
When it happens, I don't know.
The world should be ready for that, in my personal opinion. The world should be ready for that.
But, a lot of people are going to be really upset. I mean, when Heineken paid, $7 million to have him drink Heinekens rather than... people were outraged that this was a total sellout, which indeed it was. You can't mess with the Bond canon. I mean, you can't. It's kind of like you're stuck. You got to have a new story and new technology, but you can't move away from the formula. I mean, you might have a different Q, but you got to have a Q, right?
Right.
And you've got to have the meeting with M, and so they are kind of. I mean, they've got to keep up with the times, but also they've got to keep it right with the kind of ritualistic aspects of the Bond film. And the fans, don't want any heresy. I mean, they want the same old Bond. It's like a Bond film is like a kabuki play. We all know what's going to happen.
Well, now, so I would say Daniel Craig is one of the strongest Bonds I've ever seen on television. Maybe you would disagree?
I'll totally disagree. What do they say? He masters all the emotions from A to B.
Say that one more time.
He masters all the emotions from A to B.
Okay. Well,
meaning he can't act.
Oh. Okay. I thought he was pretty fierce.
But I mean, he's got great physique, but there's no humor. I mean,
None.
The thing about Sean Connery, he really was a tough guy, but there was a humorous side to him too, and Roger Moore was humorous, but he wasn't tough. And so you got to get somebody who can be a tough guy, but also can show some humor and humanity. And Daniel Craig isn't capable of doing that. I mean, he just flexes his muscles. He's got two acting modes, angry and very angry, and that's about it. It's like, whatever you say about Bond, he's got to enjoy his job. And Daniel Craig obviously doesn't. He doesn't like being Bond. He said he hates being Bond, even though they're paying him millions of dollars. And he just doesn't look like he's having fun being Bond. Whereas, James Bond lives to be James Bond,
which would be Sean Connery at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's at the end of the day. And I mean, the thing was, the Bond films of the 60s and 70s were really big films because they had a lock on the stuntmen and the technology. I mean, they could spend the money. That's why Bond goes underwater, so many times, because it's really, really expensive to shoot underwater action scenes. But with CGI, anyone could be James Bond. So you're taking away, those stunts used to be real stunts performed by the best stuntmen in Hollywood with really, really expensive sets. Now you can just do it with, computer-generated images, and that levels the playing field.
Now, Connery did do his own stunts, though, didn't he?
Oh, of course he did. I mean, because... the first two or three films were low budget. I mean, Dr. No was done, I think, for less than $1 million. And nowadays, I think a commercial for the Bond film would be $1 million. But, it was very much... If you look at the first film, the first two or three films, you'll see an amazing difference. There aren't any gadgets in Dr. No at all. Now, and that's maybe the best film of the whole... I mean, I would rate Goldfinger up there, but Dr. No was an incredible film. And
Goldfinger is kind of the one that sticks out in my mind of all of them, just because of the adventure and Otto and all them.
Goldfinger has the best villain. It has some of the best gadgets. It's certainly right up there.
And Shirley Bassey's not too bad herself. That song really is.
That's the other thing is that the Bond character within 2 or 3 films becomes this master of merchandising. The Bond theme, the song, would always be number one,
That's right, because it would lead off the movie and it just
lead off the movie, and it was a huge deal, and you would listen to it, and the credits would always be really spectacular, because at that time people didn't put too much money into the film credits. But in the Bond thing, I mean, it was, and the music plays a big part. I mean, you played that bit of music that's so nobody could listen to that music and not think of James Bond.
Right. No, you're right. And, of course, him with the gun shooting at the camera, all that.
With the gun shooting at the camera. How many other movie themes do you know that could immediately, wherever you played it, here, Timbuktu, people would say, James Bond, the music from Jaws, maybe
Jurassic
some of the
Park,
Spielberg
maybe?
movies, Close Encounters, but otherwise, a movie theme is nothing.
No, the Bond theme lasts forever, as they say. But one other aspect of this, by the way, talking about Andre Millard, the professor at the University of Alabama, are you a columnist with Zuccalo, or do you just contribute now and then?
They just asked me, so I did it.
And
I've been doing a lot of stuff like that, on blogs and podcasts, and that's the way it works these days.
And by the way, you can get his book about James Bond, Equipping James Bond, Guns, Gadgets, and Technological Enthusiasm, Skylight Books, Powell's Books, or, of course, Amazon. Too bad we didn't get you on before Amazon Prime Day. Maybe that would have been a great order on Amazon Prime Day.
Whatever happened to Coliseum Books? Oh, what a loss that was.
How many books have you written, just out of curiosity?
About 7 or 8, something like that.
And is this your first Bond, or have you written on Bond before?
No, I've written a lot about the 60s. I'm kind of into the 60s. I got a book on Beatlemania out there, and I'm really into culture of the 60s. And so Bond was what really brought me into it. I taught a class at the university about World War II over a period of about 6 years. So it was kind of World War II day by day, starting off in 1940 in 2010, and then going all the way through to 1946 in 2016. And so I was reading a lot about what people like Ian Fleming did in the war, and I'm like, oh, this is James Bond. That was my kind of moment of realization that, this has got nothing about gathering intelligence or the Secret Service. This is World War II commando stuff.
And one thing about World War II...
The equipment is World War II commando stuff, too.
And two thoughts about World War II, and thanks for joining me today on Keeping It Real. This has been a really fun conversation, and I'm willing to have you back. I'd love to have you back on, and because you're up on the news, we'd love to get you on reacting to the news from this perspective.
I'm disgusted with the news, Alex. Who wouldn't be disgusted with the news?
I know.
I mean, it's like, sometimes I think that we're back in Europe in the 1930s. We've got to break out of it. But, when we need someone like James Bond appears, so perhaps we should. I really think that, you look at the Neil Armstrongs and the Buzz Aldrins and the Jim Lovells, and you're kind of like, man, those were the Americans that we really used to respect. And It just seems that there's so few of those kind of Americans around anymore. All you got is scumbags.
Did you happen to see, and I agree with that, did you happen to see Buzz Aldrin actually punch out a guy who was...
yeah, good for him.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, man. But it's like, in today's America, it's Buzz Aldrin that's going to get in trouble for doing that.
Isn't that something?
You got to love the guy. I mean, to me, Buzz Aldrin, maybe Mike Collins too. I mean, the second guy to step on the moon is an honor, but it's also not an honor. Can you see what I'm saying?
I do. Yep.
I mean, and everything in Buzz Aldrin. When I listen to Buzz Aldrin, there always seems to be that little tinge of regret. They chose Neil to go first and not me, and I think that's got to be a burden. Because second on the moon doesn't mean diddly, does it? And
in this day and age, even Neil Armstrong was trying to correct the record on what he said, which I thought was also kind of fascinating as well.
Well, he's supposed to say "a man" rather than "man."
Right, and he pointed that out pretty clearly.
But the thing about Neil Armstrong, he's such an honest guy, you know. I mean, just that whole kind of Midwestern, oh shucks, you know. They knew they had only a 30% chance of surviving that mission, right? I mean, it was, and so when the lunar landing module splits from the command module, he says to Mike Collins, just see you later. You know, I mean, just the way he said it, yeah, see you later. Knowing in his mind that, you know, that might not happen. I mean, what really surprises me now is the sheer bores of making this live on TV. You imagine what happened if it had gone wrong. I mean, it would have been the biggest disaster for American prestige anywhere. And for Kennedy, typical Kennedy, saying, yeah, go ahead, put it on live TV, where so many things could have gone wrong. I mean, as I think it was, I don't know, as Audrey says, it was like a daisy chain, like a 1,000,000-mile-long daisy chain. One of those connections broke, we were gone. That was it. We weren't coming back. And that's, I mean, can you imagine on live TV if that lunar landing module hadn't been able to take off from the surface of the moon and they'd just been left there?
And of course that was, and by the way, that was, I'm just thinking of the 16 entirely with Kennedy, with all this. I mean, we are now leaving a 50-year anniversary period where we had to honor commemorate the assassination in 2013, which 2013 of Kennedy. And then we had to honor the Beatles at 15 with the 50th anniversary of that. So this was quite a decade, 50 years ago, and I think the moon landing was a perfect culmination. Of course, some would argue, because they're sports fans, the Mets winning was a great culmination to this.
The Mets, never heard of them.
No, right? I mean, they were only just the Miracle Mets, and they weren't even supposed to be Baltimore. That's the crazy part about that year.
What was the thing with the Jets and Joe Namath?
Well, that was the other thing. So they had won in the winter of '69, and the Mets won in the fall of '69. And I guess the Knicks had won a championship there, too. So sports-wise, we were great. Nowadays, we barely get a parade down Broadway. It's kind of sad to me, but hopefully that changes.
Yeah, you got the U.S. national women's team, though, didn't you? Wasn't that?
Oh, that was great. I'll text you a picture of that. I got one when the City Hall unleashed the confetti. It looked really nice for the women's team. Oh, yeah, it was a good day there. I was there early because my job is right outside the office, right outside along the parade route, so I was able to get there early. One other thing, though, relating to Ian Fleming, which I didn't get to yet, is the fact that he was hunting German scientists. Now, Nazi German scientists, which is in of itself exciting. But 50 years later, a woman died in, I guess, a Nazi scientist lab. I mean, did you hear about this?
No.
Well, apparently an American woman died in a lab that was run by Nazis, and no one can figure out why she was there. She was murdered there.
In Nazi Germany?
And no, recently in a Nazi bunker in.
Oh yeah. I know exactly what you're talking about. No, you're mistaken there. She was murdered. It was used as a bunker, but it was just like a lift shaft she was thrown down. One last point: Ian Fleming did spend the latter part of the war hunting down German scientists, and that's why in the books most of the bad guys are German, and several of them are scientists. But without those German scientists, we would never have gotten to the moon.
Which is kind of I saw a Time magazine article, how are they reckoning with a Nazi developing our space program? And that's, I guess that's just kind of history, and that's a tragic history. But
it is, but it's horribly ironic. I mean, Werner von Braun is a war criminal and should have been executed. But he spoke English, he looked nice. But some of those other Nazis in NASA, man, they had to hide them. The number 2 guy looked so German. He had these dueling scars on his face. And the Kennedy people were really nervous about that because their Nazi past was just facing them, I mean, these are the guys that tortured concentration camp victims. I mean, they weren't just Nazi scientists. They were Nazi in the Holocaust. I mean, that rocket program would never have gotten off the ground if they hadn't tortured and killed just thousands of inmates of concentration camps. You know, the V-2 missile, which was Werner von Braun's, innovation in the beginning of NASA, more people were killed making them than they actually killed by blowing up, in the streets of London and Antwerp.
Wow. Now,
I've always said that those guys should have been arrested and some of them executed. And I still feel very strongly about that. And, Werner von Braun was trying to kill my family too. My family lived in his home.
So do you have Jewish descent?
No, I don't. But I'm a Londoner. I'm an East Londoner, and so my grandma and my mother, as a young girl, narrowly escaped a V-2 rocket from Werner von Braun. They were out and about, and they were told to take cover, and they decided to.
You there?
And the place where they were told to take cover got destroyed. Everyone died. So, I've never been happy with Werner von Braun. But if you go to Huntsville, Alabama, he's the saint of Huntsville, which is, I think, he's a really evil guy. And
they all were. To have that mindset to develop things to kill is just in and of itself pretty evil.
But also to kill the people making it too. If one of these things blew up, they'd just go and hang 10 of the guys who built it.
And, of course, that also meant, if they did go off with a success, they were going to kill him anyway because they didn't want the secret to get out. So there was that.
Yeah, they're going to kill him anyway. So they killed literally thousands of workers in the plant that manufactured the rockets. And when Werner von Braun was asked about this, he said, I wasn't there. And that was a lie. He knew it was going on. Have you ever heard of that comedian called Tom Lehrer? Just played the piano.
Oh, I love Tom Lehrer. Pigeons, feeding pigeons in the park. It's a great song.
Yeah, man. But he's got a great song about Werner von Braun. Ask the widows and orphans of old London town. They owe their payments. They owe their damage payments to Werner von Braun. That's a great song, and he ended up on top of the pile, which I think was really an injustice. But without him, we wouldn't have had that Saturn V, and we wouldn't have got anyone anywhere.
Well, let me ask you this one thing then. So, obviously, do you think Aldrin Armstrong knew of this, and they just decided to overlook? How do they react to this?
They basically they redacted all the records of these people. So, as far as I know, the basic guys, doing the work just thought of them as Germans because their Nazi connections. The army had just basically, destroyed the records. Once we made it to the moon and the Apollo program was closed down, then they said, "Oh my goodness, these are war criminals. We'll have to send them back to Germany," and several of them got sent back. But Werner von Braun was so well established. He's not a rocket scientist, but he's a fantastic manager and salesman. And probably it was that tour of Huntsville with Werner von Braun that just blew Kennedy's mind. That's when they fired up that enormous Saturn rocket and gave it like 2 minutes of this horrendous blast. And that made a huge impression on Kennedy. And then he said to his people, well, what can we do? Just give me something we can do to beat the Russians on something. And they said, well, we could go to the moon. He said, that's it. We'll go.
Well, there you go. And do you cover any of that in your book, or is it strictly Bond only?
No, there's a lot of space. And I just think Kennedy and Bond are two really interesting people. They have in the same room. That J. Hoberman thing is like they were really kind of working off each other because, Kennedy was a hawk. He was most definitely a hawk. And he was a Cold War warrior, and he loved the ladies, and he loved the finer things in life, and And so he was made for Bond, and Bond was made for him.
And I wonder if there's a picture of them together. I don't know if there is, but...
Well, there was a famous meeting. They had a dinner together. Fleming was a very gregarious, outgoing guy. He knew a lot of people in Washington. And they had a dinner party together, and he told Kennedy, allegedly, you know, it's pointless don't try and kill Castro, just humiliate him, just make him look stupid. And so it was probably Fleming, that came up with the idea, why don't you do something, put some chemical on him that his beard will fall out.
Remember that? They tried that with the cigar, if I'm not mistaken.
They tried that. I don't know how, but I thought I heard the thing they're going to put something in his boot polish, which would then rise up. But, I mean, crazy ideas like that, you know, Fleming was all for it. And one last thing, you know, when the people in the intelligence service watched the movies, both in the Russians and the Americans, they'd always go back and say, why can't we have one of those things that Bond had? And so Eon Productions, after Thunderball, were getting all these inquiries from various intelligence agencies, like, could we have one of those things that you got for Bond? I mean, that's art influenced life in the James Bond era.
And hopefully, one prediction, next movie they're working on, do you know the technology they're going to try and, you know, or use?
I think they've gone to the actual realm of the ridiculous, but it wouldn't surprise me if it had a very heavy artificial intelligence component to it, and it wouldn't surprise me if there were more transformative technologies in that, you know, cars turns into submarines, or, you know, trains turn into planes and stuff like that. But one thing is for sure, they've got to come up with something new. And the marketplace is full of James Bond figures like now. I mean, you know, and so they've got to come up with something bigger and better. And my feeling is, if the movies don't make as much money as before, then they'll have a female James Bond or a James Bond of color. That will be the kind of, you know, the deciding moment. But, you know, there's been so much ridiculous technology in the last few Bond, you know, like the invisible car and stuff.
Right,
like, what other crazy stuff?
I'm just waiting for the self-driving Aston Martin. That's what I kind of want to see.
Come on, if you had an Aston Martin, wouldn't you want to drive it yourself?
Of course I would, but
I mean,
the tech crazies are out and about, you know?
I know. Who wants a self-driving? I mean, yeah, a self-driving Corolla, but an Aston Martin, man, I want full control.
Yeah, so I don't know. They'll probably break out something ridiculous. So.
You know what? The one thing I do predict is that sooner or later it's going to be a Tesla that Bond will drive. Because the Tesla,
yes, Tesla for sure,
are right in that kind of technological enthusiast mode. So it wouldn't. No, these days, you know, you have to pay the film company to let them use your car, not vice versa. So.
Oh right, I guess Aston Martin was paying them to drive the car, weren't they?
No, not initially. Not initially. I mean, initially. Aston Martin were like, who the hell are you? You know, why should we bother with you? And I think they had to buy, you know, they always have to buy 2 or 3 cars. They can't just buy one because they smash them up.
Sure.
So initially, I think Aston Martin were like, well, who the hell are you, you know? And after Goldfinger, you know, when the movie opened, they had the car. They had 3 cars going around the country. So when people went to the theater, there was that beautiful DB5 sitting there. That was a huge, huge part of the deal. It was also like the toy of the year. You know, models of those cars were the best-selling toy. And after that, you had to go to the Bond people and persuade them to use the car. You remember Roger Moore had a Lotus Esprit, which kind of looked like a bit like a DeLorean.
Yes, I kind of remember that.
Turned into a submarine, beautiful-looking car. Well,
it goes in the water. Yeah, I remember the water. Yeah. Yep.
Well, Lotus, who were a British concern, they said, what can we do? So what they did, they found out, Eon Productions, who produce the films are in the UK. So they found out.
You there?
And then the Bond people said, "Yeah, we want." We said, "Okay, we'll give you 3." And they gave him 3 Esperes, which is probably a lot of money. And of course, they made it all back because everybody wanted. You know, if Bond presents something, there used to be something called the Fleming effect, which was about Fleming's ability as a writer. But there's something called the Bond effect. That if James Bond wears something or uses something, the sales go through the ceiling. I mean, there was that Burberry kind of coat that Daniel Craig wore a couple of films ago. Immediately, that sold out on YouTube, eBay, for like 1,000 times more expensive than it was. I love watches. I can't afford them, but I love watches. And, Omega produced James Bond's watches, which are about $5 or $6 grand, sell out like crazy.
Yeah, I am sure. Well, I got to have you back. This was fun, and definitely when the new Bond comes around, I hope they put you on set for a little bit with the new book coming out. That'd be kind of neat if you're able to get on set.
I hope so. Need to sell some books, make some royalties.
That's right. All right. Well,
all right.
Thank you so much. Andre Millard in the University of Alabama, history professor there. Take his class if you're listening to this and going to college. U of Alabama in Birmingham. Can't beat it, right?
But hopefully you could be in New York and take it from NYU, which is a pretty good school.
Yes, sir. All right. Thank you so much. And
all right. Thank you, Alex.
Let's end this with a little Bond music. Thank you so much for joining tonight.
All right.
Here on Keeping It Real. Bye-bye now. Keeping It Real with Alexander Garrett.